The basement door. The Johnsons had been looking for the perfect house for years. As a young couple with plans to start a family, they wanted a place that was spacious, affordable, and in a good neighborhood. When they stumbled upon the old Victorian house on Elm Street, it seemed like a dream come true. The house was large, with 3 stories, a spacious backyard, and plenty of charm. The price was surprisingly low, which the realtor attributed to the house's age and the fact that it had been on the market for a while. Despite a few creaks and groans typical of an old house, everything seemed perfect. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving behind some furniture and other odds and ends, which the Johnsons didn't mind. They considered it part of the house's character. The only oddity was the locked basement door. The realtor had mentioned it in passing, saying the key had been lost years ago, but assured them that a locksmith could easily take care of it. After moving in, the Johnsons quickly settled into their new home. Emily, a freelance writer, loved the house's vintage charm, and her husband, James, an architect, appreciated the craftsmanship of the old Victorian structure. They spent their first few days unpacking, decorating, and getting to know their new neighbors. Everything was going well, but there was always a strange feeling about the basement door. Emily couldn't help but feel a slight unease every time she passed by it. One evening, as they were relaxing after dinner, James mentioned the basement door. "I think we should get that door unlocked," he said, glancing toward the hallway where the door was. "It's odd not knowing what's down there. Could be just storage or maybe some old junk we could clear out." Emily nodded. "Yeah, it's been bugging me too. Maybe there's some old family heirloom or something interesting down there." The next day, James called a locksmith. The man arrived promptly, a middle-aged fellow with a grizzled beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He worked on the door for a while, trying various tools and methods, but nothing seemed to work. "That's strange," the locksmith muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's like the lock's been fused shut. I've never seen anything like this before. Can't you just break it down?" James suggested, growing impatient. The locksmith hesitated. "I could, but something feels off about this. Are you sure you want to open it?" James exchanged a glance with Emily. Despite the locksmith's warning, their curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. They nodded. With a resigned sigh, the locksmith fetched a crowbar from his van. He wedged it into the door frame and, with a grunt, pried the door open. The wood splintered, and the door creaked as it swung open, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs leading into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from the depths, carrying with it a musty, almost metallic odor. Emily shivered involuntarily, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. "Well, there you go," the locksmith said, packing up his tools. "But I'd be careful if I were you. Some doors are better left closed." With that ominous warning, the locksmith left, leaving James and Emily standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the black abyss. "Do you want to go down?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emily hesitated. "I don't know. Something about this feels wrong. Probably just because it's been locked for so long," James reasoned, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. "But we should at least check it out. We can't just leave it like this." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. James grabbed a flashlight, and they descended the stairs together. The steps creaked under their weight, and the darkness seemed to swallow them whole as they ventured deeper. The basement was much larger than they had expected. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty jars, old tools, and various other items that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with dust. But there was something else, something that immediately caught their attention. At the far end of the basement, partially obscured by shadows, was another door. This one was made of heavy wood, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It looked ancient, far older than the rest of the house. "What do you think is behind that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. James didn't answer immediately. He was drawn to the door, almost hypnotized by the intricate carvings. "I don't know," he finally said, "but it's like nothing I've ever seen before." As they approached the door, the air grew colder, and the musty smell intensified. There was a palpable sense of unease, as if the basement itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. "Maybe we shouldn't," Emily started, but James was already reaching for the door handle. The handle was icy cold to the touch, and as James turned it, there was a loud click. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing an even darker passageway beyond. The air that rushed out was frigid, and Emily swore she could hear faint whispers like distant voices carried on the wind. "I don't like this," Emily said, pulling back. "Let's just close it and forget about it." But James was too intrigued. "Come on, just a quick look," he said, stepping through the doorway. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but she couldn't let James go in alone. Reluctantly, she followed him into the passage. The darkness was suffocating, and their flashlight beams seemed to barely penetrate it. The walls were made of rough stone, damp and cold to the touch, and the floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of dust. As they walked, the passage seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice echoing eerily in the narrow space. "I don't know," James replied, his voice tense. "But I think we should head back. This doesn't feel right." They turned to retrace their steps, but the passageway behind them had changed. The door they had come through was gone, replaced by another stretch of dark, twisting corridor. Panic surged through Emily as she realized they were trapped. "James, where's the door?" she cried, her voice rising in fear. "I don't know," he shouted back, frantically searching for any sign of the way out. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just voices. They were taunting, mocking them, telling them they would never escape. The passage seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing closer and closer until it felt like they were being crushed. In their frantic search for an exit, they stumbled upon a room, a large, circular chamber with high, vaulted ceilings. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. Surrounding the altar were more of the strange symbols carved into the floor, walls, and ceiling. The air was thick with a malevolent presence, and the temperature dropped further until their breath hung in the air like smoke. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling as she clung to James. But before they could move, the chamber doors slammed shut behind them with a thunderous boom. The walls of the room began to pulse with a dark energy, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar, filling their minds with fear and despair. Suddenly, the stone altar began to glow with a sickly green light, and the air around it shimmered, distorting as if reality itself was bending. From the center of the altar, a dark figure began to emerge, a twisted, shadowy being that seemed to be made of the darkness itself. It had no discernible features, just a mass of writhing shadows and malevolent energy. The figure's presence was overwhelming, radiating an aura of pure evil that made their skin crawl. Emily and James were frozen in place, unable to move as the entity slowly turned its attention to them. "You should not have come here." The entity's voice was a deep, guttural growl, echoing within their minds rather than in the air. "This is not your world." Emily felt her sanity slipping as the entity's voice drilled into her thoughts. She could feel its cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around her mind, pulling her deeper into despair. "Please, let us go," she managed to choke out, tears streaming down her face. The entity seemed to laugh, a sound like grinding stone. "You are already lost. There is no escape." As the words echoed in their minds, the room began to change. The walls started to melt away, revealing a vast, endless void of darkness. The floor crumbled beneath them, and they found themselves falling, tumbling into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices screaming in agony, driving them to the brink of madness. Just as they thought they would be lost forever, everything stopped. They were no longer falling, no longer surrounded by darkness. They were back in the basement of their house, standing in front of the locked door. The door was closed, the carvings on it now faded and barely visible. The air was still and silent, the malevolent presence gone. But the fear lingered, a deep, primal terror that had taken root in their souls. Without a word, James and Emily bolted out of the basement, slamming the door behind them. They didn't stop until they were outside, standing in the bright sunlight, gasping for air as if they had been underwater. We need to get out of here," James finally said, his voice shaky. Emily nodded, unable to speak. They didn't bother packing their things. They just got in their car and drove, leaving the house and whatever horror lurked within it behind. They never returned to Elm Street. The house was eventually sold to another family, who seemed unaware of its dark history. The basement door remained locked, its secrets hidden away from the world. But Emily and James were never the same. The memories of that night haunted them, the whispers echoing in their minds long after they had left the house. They knew that the basement door was more than just an entryway. It was a gateway to something far darker, something that had glimpsed them from the other side and would never let them forget. And somewhere, deep within the labyrinth beneath the house, the entity waited. It had tasted their fear, and it knew that someday someone else would come. And when they did, it would be ready,